Hello everyone, my name is Basilisk, and welcome back to For Fun and Profit for the first time in over 4 years. It's just me as usual for these videos, but Caffeine Dragon is still doing the editing. You might be able to see future editing Donovan's dulcet captions telling me off for coming up with this video, or yelling at Not in This Video Donovan for agreeing to edit it. I don't know, I won't see it till the video's ready to upload. Alright then, today we'll be talking about class design, comparing D&D 5th edition and Pathfinder 2nd edition. But before that, I do have a couple of quick things to address. First off, I'm not bringing For Fun and Profit back as a regular thing. There will probably be more in the future, but there's not going to be any kind of regular schedule for them. It'll just be whenever things line up and we have a big enough footage lead that getting these edited won't kill our upload schedule. Secondly, this channel is normally about video games, so why am I talking about two tabletop RPGs? Why not talk about MMOs or something? Well, it is true that I currently have Final Fantasy XIV, Dragon Quest X, Lord of the Rings Online, City of Heroes Homecoming, and Destiny 2 installed across various devices, so I certainly could, but it actually wouldn't be as effective. Each of those games has a pretty different gameplay, so making direct comparisons would actually be more difficult than you think, and that's not even getting to how classes in City of Heroes and Destiny function pretty fundamentally different than the others in a way that doesn't serve this particular video. Might talk more about them in a different video, but not today. By contrast, while D&D 5th edition and Pathfinder 2nd edition do differ in the details of their rules, they are both offering roughly the same experience to their players and operate on similar enough underlying principles that comparing them will be a much cleaner and neater process. However, the bigger reason is one of mechanical clarity. Video games, by design, tend to hide some of their rules and information from the player. Things like damage calculations are the most obvious, but even how class abilities interact with each other isn't always made clear in detail. The reason for this is that all of this is automated, and the player doesn't generally need to know the fine detail to play the game, so it would just be a bunch of unnecessary information to dump on the player's head. This isn't a bad thing, but if you're studying game design, it can be annoying. Tabletop games, by nature of the players having to personally handle every ruling and outcome, can't do this. As a result, tabletop games, whether they be RPGs, board games, or even card games, have to be very clear and explicit in their rules, making them an excellent case for studying how rules work in practice. In general, I fully believe that anyone studying game design should spend a lot of time at the tabletop, and why not practice what I preach? Of course, another reason is that I've just been wanting to talk about the differences in class design between D&D and Pathfinder for a long time, and the opportunity has yet to present itself. I mean, it's not like I have a YouTube channel or anything to just shout into the void from. That would be silly, like uploading Let's Plays of PlayStation 2 and GBA games. Wait. Ah, well, everyone knows YouTube is for gag dubs of children's animes and unauthorized uploads of Newgrounds Flash videos. Anyway, last disclaimer, I'll be focusing on the 2014 version of D&D 5th edition and the pre-remaster version of Pathfinder 2nd edition, largely because those are the versions I've actually played and DM'd. I am familiar loosely with the 2024 version of D&D and the Pathfinder remaster, but I haven't actually played anything from either yet. That said, the general design philosophy behind the classes remains unchanged, so it really shouldn't change anything about this video. I'm also not getting too far into the specifics of any of the classes. I'll be using examples to compare and contrast, but I'm not doing a deep dive on any specific class and how they play. I'd be open to doing something like that later on, let us know if that's something you'd be interested in, but it's beyond the scope of today's video. Alright, enough beating around the bush, let's get into it. Okay, so a class in an RPG serves to basically sell a specific fantasy to the player, basically giving them a rough outline of a role to immerse themselves in. Class design, then, is the guidelines for how a game's classes give different fantasies and roles for the player to step into. So far, so good. Now, there's fundamentally two different layers to how a class is designed. The first is thematic, the flavor and stylings of a class that give it an immediately apparent identity. The second is mechanical, the actual nitty-gritty of how a class functions in gameplay, usually designed to reinforce the theming. Naturally, we'll be talking about both of them in broad strokes. Now, while there are a lot of specific ways one could go about designing classes in broad strokes, there's two different schools of thought that literally every class system I've come across falls into. The first is to offer generalized classes and let the player decide the fine details as to what specific fantasy each class fulfills for them. The second is to make specific, bespoke classes for specific and individual fantasies and roles. Neither is inherently better or worse than the other, but they do require very different approaches and appeal to different types of players. Before we get into specific comparisons, let's discuss how the two engines we'll be focusing on today handle it, because they fall into different schools of thought. D&D takes the first, offering very generalized classes that can fit a number of different fantasies and roles in a player's head. Pathfinder takes the second, offering classes that very deliberately target specific fantasies and roles for the player to step into. So, how does this work in practice from a player's perspective? Would they even notice? Well, yes, absolutely. Let's say a player wants to make a character that's a detective and wants their playstyle to reflect that. In D&D, the player may take the Rogue class and the Inquisitive subclass, since that setup mechanically reflects a character that's very observant. In Pathfinder, the player is most likely going to take the Inspector class, a class that is very literally and very obviously made for detective characters from the ground up. Its subclass equivalents are even all based around different methods of gathering clues and information. Now really quick, I should note that players may not necessarily want their mechanics to so closely reflect their character's actual in-universe job, and that's fine. Donovan and I actually both have detective PCs in D&D, and neither of them took the class and subclass mix I mentioned earlier. Donovan's is a gunner that uses guns with magic bullets, and mine is a fire mage with phoenix powers. Their classes reflect different aspects about their character, and how a player wants their character's class to connect to their character will obviously affect how they make their choice. Alright, so that's all well and good from the player's perspective, but what about from the developer's perspective? How do these two schools of thought affect how classes are designed from game to game? Well, to answer that, we're going to have to get more into the weeds with each system, so let's go ahead and get started. Right, so as we've established, D&D prefers to have classes with a broad feel, both mechanically and thematically. Then leave it up to the player to decide what specific role and fantasy their character fulfills. Now, there are a few mechanical aids to help the player narrow it down, most prominently subclasses and spells. In order to accomplish this, the developers have had to make classes with a feel that can each be broadly applied across a frankly ridiculous spectrum of character types. Then each class has subclasses that represent, again in very broad strokes, somewhat more specific characters. Then for spellcasters, there's also a broad selection of spells that can narrow that fantasy down even more if the player wants, though it's not really a requirement. The end result is that, in general, D&D's class design is meant to work with a broad spectrum of ideas. It's very rare for a character type to not be able to fit comfortably within a few different classes, giving players broader options when it comes to making their character. This is part of the reason that D&D doesn't really get new classes added to it, instead focusing on new subclasses and such for existing classes. Even counting Artificer and Bloodhunter, which Wizards of the Coast apparently doesn't, there's only 14 classes in D&D 5e, and honestly, it doesn't really need more for its class design. Those 14 work really well for what D&D is going for. To illustrate how well this works, in fact, let's go ahead and make ourselves an adventuring party of 5 characters. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go through the whole character creation process for these people. We're still focusing on class design, so we're only really worried about the fantasy behind each character and how the class options they have reflect it. I am aware that background and heritage choices are also used to reinforce that fantasy, but frankly, adding those in would bloat the video, and we don't have time for all my issues with Wizards of the Coast's approach to background design. It's a mess! Our first character is going to be a holy warrior type, someone with divine powers reinforcing martial skill. So how many options do we have for this? Well, I mean, there's a few easy picks. The first, obviously, is the Paladin class, which has this as its general fantasy with lots of options for what the character is all zealous about. But it's not the only option. Another really clear pick is a Cleric class with the War Domain subclass, which gives it heavy armor, martial weapons, and plenty of holy power to wield. A third is a Barbarian that took the path of the Zealot, capable of unleashing a literally divine wrath. So, yeah, that works. Our second character is going to be someone who's trying to unravel some fundamental secret of the universe at a cost to themselves. Warlock is an obvious pick here, possibly the Great Old One or Undying patrons. Or a sorcerer with the Wild Magic bloodline who lost control of their magic as the price for lost knowledge. Or perhaps a blood hunter of the profane soul who can no longer be blind to the demons that hide in the shadows of the world. For our third character, let's go with an undertaker whose familiarity with death fuels them. We have clerics, of course, who have both the death and grave domains for 2 different flavors of death-themed powers. We also have monks who practice the way of the long death, who gain enlightenment through their obsession with death. Wizards who focus on the school of necromancy are also a clear option here. Our fourth character will be an Aeroflynn type of fellow, someone who has a very stylish and eye-catching fighting style. They might be a bard who practices the methods of the College of Swords as a sword juggler or the like. They might also be a fighter with the Battle Master subclass, effortlessly controlling the battlefield with their superior style. They may also be a rogue and take the swashbuckler subclass for a bit of panache. Our final character will be a hero with a piece of divinity, empowered by special items that give them strength beyond most mortals. They might be a paladin whose oath is fueled by divine artifacts. They could also be a warlock whose patron is a fiend trapped in a magic artifact that the character wears. They could also be an Echo Knight fighter who uses a magic weapon that allows them to create a transient copy of themselves. Now, by no means are any of these the only options for any of these characters. Warlock in particular could be a valid option for all of them, even the first. Bloodhunter and Paladin could also be used for more of these than I did, and Cleric has so many subclasses on an already pretty versatile base that it's harder to find character types that it can't fit. Now, I think I've made my point about the versatility of D&D's class design, but any approach to class design is going to have downsides, so let's talk about the ones hanging around D&D's neck. The first is that because of its generality, there's not as much mechanical support for specific fantasies, and two characters that seem very different out of combat and might play identically in combat. Let's take our Errol Flynn idea from earlier. Say two players want a character that's an agile fighter that taunts and banters with their opponents. Player 1 is looking for more of a Zorro character, someone that's heroic and prefers misdirection and feints. Player 2 might be going for a pirate that directly mocks and belittles their opponent. Both go for the swashbuckler rogue because it has mechanics that reflect this. In terms of roleplay and personality, these two characters would act pretty differently, but once combat starts, they will have the exact same mechanics and pretty much the exact same playstyle. Especially in cases where this actually happens, it can be a big letdown to both players. Another issue is that with the classes being so broad, it can be harder to come up with a character idea. Most of the classes aren't going to immediately suggest a character idea the moment a player takes a look at them, and it can be hard to finalize your character when there's 3 or more classes that all work for what you want to make. Finally, because they don't need to add new classes, it doesn't actually take that long to really come to grips with D&D's classes as a collective system, and it can lead to periods where a player might feel like they can't really do anything new with the game. This problem, mixing with the above, can actually be fatal to a player's desire to play the game, which is a genuine concern. All of this is to say that this style of class design gives a player a lot of options for how specifically they want to make their character, but it can lead to the experience not really clicking as solidly as a player might want, or to a player feeling burned out because of how broad the classes are. It's a mixed bag, but especially if you don't want to get too lost in the nitty-gritty of combat design and mechanical character customization, it works pretty well. As for Pathfinder, we've already established that it prefers a more focused approach, crafting specific classes to fill specific fantasies and roles. This would run the risk of feeling samey, for instance having 2 inspectors in a party, but Pathfinder handles this through the rest of its class design. In order to get the class design they wanted, Pathfinder's developers had to focus the entirety of each class entirely around its specific fantasy. But in order to avoid making them samey, they had to give each class a lot of options as to how it fulfills that fantasy. Take our swashbuckler rogue conundrum from the D&D classes. The reason that works out that way is because both characters will have the exact same features. In Pathfinder, the player is actually given a selection of different features to choose at each level that give each player a good amount of customization of their character's mechanics. This is added to by most classes having subclass variants that narrow down their focus even further. We already brought up Investigator and how its 4 methodologies all feature different methods of gathering clues and information. But there's 56 regular features that the player will be choosing between as they build their character to customize how their investigator plays. Now, you might be thinking, how does having that many options help create a specific fantasy? Shouldn't that make it more broad? Well, no. Each of these options are specific, bespoke options for the investigator class, and they are all geared towards fulfilling different versions of a detective fantasy. This does mean, however, the Pathfinder can't rest on its existing classes and has to add new ones decently regularly. Currently, Pathfinder has 25 classes released and another 4 either waiting for release or in active playtesting, with no indication that they plan on slowing down anytime soon. However, older classes don't receive new subclass variations or features all that frequently. To see how this winds up working in practice, let's take our 5-person adventuring party from the D&D examples and see how quickly they find a match in Pathfinder. Now mind, despite Pathfinder focusing on bespoke classes, you can make alternatives work, and one of these examples will discuss that, so let's get into it. Same rules as before. First, we have our Holy Warrior. You could make a cleric or fighter work, but most players who want this type of character are going to be drawn straight to the champion class, which comes with different flavors of divine causes for the player to center their character around, and actually has some robust support for an evil champion, which we'll talk about that more in a bit. Next, we have our Seeker of Answers, who pays for their curiosity. The Oracle class is purpose-built for these fellows, allowing them to select the exact mystery of the universe they're trying to unravel, each with a specific cost the character will be paying for their curiosity. They also get specific spells related to the mystery they're trying to unravel, and the features that let them access special powers in exchange for a temporary worsening of their curse. Third up is our Undertaker friend. Now, the most obvious pick would be the Necromancer class, but that's currently in active playtesting and thus may not be allowed at your table if your GM doesn't like fun. But we can still make this character type work. A Witch could get the Devourer of Decay patron for death-themed magic, Oracle has a Bones mystery for a similar effect, and Sorcerer has a Psychopomp bloodline. None of these have quite as much support for an undead-focused playstyle as the Necromancer itself does, or will, I guess, rather, though, and we'll discuss that a bit later. Now, our fourth adventurer is our Errol Flynn friend. Swashbuckler is the clear choice for this fancy fellow, with quite a few different styles of showing off how skilled they are. They could focus on a sort of combat dance, bragging about how good they are, simply outfencing their foes, or maybe even constantly spouting off clever witticisms like they learned how to sword fight on Monkey Island. Finally, we have our Divinity-touched hero and their magic items. They'll be drawn to the Exemplar class, which is specifically about getting boosts and boons from magic items, and comes with options for specific magic items and how they can boost the Exemplar and their allies, as well as mechanical representation of what kind of hero they are and how their piece of divinity affects them. Now, as I explained with our Undertaker, just because there's a class that's pre-built for your character type, doesn't mean you can't make another class work, and you can have a lot of fun doing that. But I believe I've established most of the benefits of this more bespoke approach to class design and how it can affect character creation. One I actually didn't mention is one of the things D&D had as a problem. Since the classes are so focused around a specific fantasy, it's a lot easier to get a character idea by just roaming over the class list and seeing what jumps out at you, with new classes giving you new ideas to play with. But, as I said with the D&D examples, there's going to be downsides to any approach, so let's take a look at the problems trying to pull Pathfinder down. The first, biggest, and most obvious problem was represented by our Undertaker. If there isn't a class for your specific fantasy, you're gonna have to put more effort into making the other classes work for your fantasy than you would in D&D. Otherwise, you could just find yourself waiting until a class specifically for your fantasy is released, which could take a while. Second, all of this comes at a cost of complexity. Remember, 54 features to choose from for just Inspector, not counting the methodologies. And that's just one class out of 25 released classes. Pathfinder is a game with a much higher information load, and it takes more time and effort to really come to grips with each class than it does with D&D. Third, if none of the fantasies offered by the classes are really hitting you, it can be hard to come up with a character. Their very specificity can make them feel limiting if you're having trouble coming up with an idea, and that's never a fun experience. It can also lead to a player getting frustrated if they're trying to make a character and having this problem. All of this comes out to Pathfinder being a game that offers very specific fantasies to its player, but can struggle if none of them appeal to the player at that moment. It's also a harder game to get into because it has so much more information. All we've covered today is its classes. The rest of the game doesn't have any less options. Again, though, that's for another time. Again, like D&D, it's a mixed bag, but one that works well, especially for players that want a lot of fine control over how their character plays or that prefer a more specified design. Alright, so now that we've covered general design, we're going to do a few cases of direct compare and contrast. This will give us a better look at some of the immediate differences between the two engines, as well as letting me answer some questions folks might have about some of the fringe cases for either system. First up, we'll bring up two classes that we discussed during the examples we did earlier, namely the Paladin from D&D and the Champion from Pathfinder. The D&D Paladin is considered to be one case where the generalized theming of D&D gives way to something much more specific, and there's an element of truth to this. Paladin is very focused around being a holy warrior, bound by their oaths. But that base concept is still pretty broad and allows for a lot of wiggle room with the various oaths you can take, helping to narrow it down to the specific fantasy you want. But is the Champion still a more specified class than Paladin? Honestly, this is the only case I can think of where the D&D class is actually more narrow than the Pathfinder concept. While both classes are all about delivering the fantasy of being a warrior empowered by the divine, the Paladin doesn't really have as many good options for an evil or morally ambiguous character as the Champion does. My understanding is the Paladin used to be a fighter subclass, which might explain why Paladin is so much more narrow than the other D&D classes, but it does still make it an odd fringe case. Another case where people assume a D&D class has a more specific playstyle in mind is the Cleric. Now, Cleric in both D&D and Pathfinder gives the general fantasy of being a servant of the divine and most likely an official member of a religious order. But people frequently assume that both cases are further narrowed into being specifically heal-bot classes designed solely as support classes. There's an element of truth to this in Pathfinder where you have to put some significant work into not having at least an above-average healing capacity. But Clerics in D&D have a much broader range of playstyles, with it being entirely possible to make a cleric that has no healing capacity whatsoever, and is still a very effective member of the party. With some of its subclasses, such as the War or Tempest domains, you can make a cleric that's primarily a physical fighter and still have it be very viable. That said, the Pathfinder cleric can still be an effective fighter, but it is primarily designed to be a healer. Honestly though, I think this misconception about the D&D cleric in particular comes from a lot of video games using cleric as the designated healer class. Anyone who's actually really worked with the class in gameplay knows that's not how it works. Not in D&D anyways. There's a few other odd cases in both systems where some classes don't quite play by the rules. Warlock has its pact boons that almost feel like a Pathfinder subclass variant, or the D&D Wizard has its subclasses mostly based off types of magic rather than any other theme. Then there's the Pathfinder variants of Fighter and Monk, which don't have any subclass equivalents at all. Both classes are entirely based around selecting from the regular pool of features. It's a little odd. Now, none of those are really big enough variations to be worth going into for this broad overview, though. So, let's cover one more difference between the two approaches. As you might be able to guess, the difference in design philosophies between the two engines means that several character types that are largely represented under one class in D&D could well be split into a few classes in Pathfinder. A good example of this is the Artificer class in D&D, which covers alchemy and inventing under its umbrella. Plus, it's the only class with a specified note for using firearms. In Pathfinder, these are all represented by 3 different classes. Alchemy is the domain of the Alchemist class, inventions go to the Inventor class, and there's also a dedicated Gunslinger class, although that's not the only class that can use firearms, it's just the one that most specifically revolves around doing so. This sort of division happens a few other places as well, but there's also cases where a Pathfinder class can be considered a combination of ideas that you see separated in D&D. Kineticist, a class all about elemental manipulation, is a good example. That would be something that would be spread across, like, Monk and, like, Wizard? But you get what I mean. Finally, it should be noted that both D&D and Pathfinder give the players ways to alter the mechanical theming of their character to better fit the fantasy they want fulfilled. D&D does this through multi-classing, essentially letting the player merge separate classes together to get a mix of mechanics from multiple classes. Pathfinder's approach is its archetype system, where it gives the player access to a large number of what are functionally mini-classes that frequently fulfill some very specific fantasies that aren't quite given full classes. Examples of that would be the Pirate or Bounty Hunter archetypes. There are also archetypes such as Brawler or Bulwark for hand-to-hand combat or heavy defenses respectively, that allow the player access to specific parts of a character concept without having to take a full class for them. There's also archetypes based around the classes themselves that serve as like a snack platter of a class, but honestly those are not quite as interesting as most of the rest of the archetypes. Both multiclassing and archetypes allow for more customization of the class system, but they are also strictly additions to the base class system, which decides most of a character's playstyle. This is why I didn't cover either system, most notably archetypes, in much detail, as they're largely an addendum to the base class design and can't be taken right at character creation. Thus, most of the time they're not going to impact a player's initial decision-making quite as strongly as just picking their base class. And that's it. Like I said at the start, I didn't want to go into too much gritty detail for this video. I could have done a general overview for each class and each system, for instance, and part of me was tempted, but I felt that would have bogged down the video too much for what I wanted it to be. I also know there's a few things that people might have included that I didn't, so let me briefly go over a few of those. Firstly, I didn't discuss homebrew because that's outside the general class design, and what someone does for homebrew has no real relationship with what official sources do. I don't have anything against homebrew, I use quite a bit of it, and I even made a homebrew class for D&D, the Gunlance Wielder. It just didn't really have a place in this video, since with homebrew there's no unified design sense anymore. Secondly, I didn't bring up any specific mathematics for either system. This was because while the two engines are similar enough for broad comparison, their math gets increasingly different the further you get into each system, and I don't think anyone wanted this video to completely derail, so I could explain things like the skill ranks of Pathfinder, or how each engine calculates its HP. Plus, things like that are universal rules for each engine, so that kind of thing would be more suited for a general overview of each engine rather than a class design discussion. Thirdly, I didn't discuss any special rules that might affect how players consider their class options. Pathfinder in particular has the free archetype and dual class rules that are meant for either smaller tables or to make stronger overall characters, and they could drastically change the decision making, especially dual class. However, rules like that aren't the way the base game is designed, and are explicitly listed as alterations to suit real-life situations the DM might be dealing with, and therefore won't be universally applied at every table. Alright folks, that wraps this video up. I could keep going, there's all sorts of weird fringe cases and such, but I'd either be largely repeating myself or just bogging down the video with unnecessary detail, so let's cut it here. Like I said, if you would be interested in more detailed looks at individual classes, let us know and we'll consider it. As for when the next For Fun and Profit will be, or what it might be about, I have no idea at this point. Depends on what else Donovan and I have going on, and whether or not we can afford to take the time, especially the editing time in Donovan's case, to make these without screwing up our regular upload schedule. This has been Basilisk, thank you all so much for watching, thanks to future editing Donovan for editing this, and we'll see you all next time. Good night, folks!